This is Off Planet Radio.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Off Planet Radio. I'm Randy Moggins, and we're back in interview mode right now. Really not, I always say interview, but that's kind of the formal title for what really is conversation and interesting insights with people that are fascinating, interesting, and bring to the table data and views that I think all of you can kind of resonate with. So with me today from down under is returning back for another round is my good friend. I consider him a colleague, a friend, somebody who I think we both kind of buzz on the same oscillators a lot of times. And so we want to welcome back to the show, James Bartley. Welcome back, my friend.
Thanks, Randy. Pleased to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. I didn't have a bio sitting in front of me. I consider you to be both experiencer, researcher, and kind of the guy that likes to sometimes gently or not so gently bump heads inside of the UFO paranormal stage that we kind of dwell in. But give us a little bit of your background on how you got into this and where you're coming from.
Well, I've had a lifetime's worth of ET and UFO experiences and a lot of psychic phenomena also. It happened to me so often in my youth that I just thought it was normal. I just thought all kids went through paranormal experiences. All kids had strange dreams and weird bedroom visitations. It was only when I talked to my peer group and asked them about it, no, it never happened to me. Don't know what you're talking about. But at least back then, the ridicule factor wasn't there. This is like the early 70s. Like, say, 1972, I would have been 8 years old. Mm-hmm. So, you know, kids were a lot more open-minded back then. So I think it really culminated, and I talked about this in previous interviews and podcasts, summer of 1990. I come back from Germany. Actually, by then it was early autumn in the Northern Hemisphere, September. And I come back from Germany back to California, and I just had a series of UFO events culminating in a full-blown waking alien abduction. 3 reptilian grays in my bedroom, and then they took me up into their ship, and things really unraveled from there. So the next morning I woke up a basket case, basically. But my curiosity kind of, I wouldn't say it overrode my fear, but it was a motivating force. I had to find out what the hell happened to me. So we didn't, of course, have Amazon books back then. We didn't have the internet. So I just got in my car and kept driving to this shopping center at Eastridge Mall in Eastside San Jose, where there was a big shopping mall. I don't know if the bookseller is still around, but there was a big book chain back then called B. Dalton's, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I used to go there to get military history books, right? And then when I woke up after that horrifying experience, I started driving there and bought up as many books about alien abductions as I could find. Of course, the Whitley Strieber books, the Bud Hopkins books, the books by Raymond E. Fowler about Betty Andreasson. Mm-hmm. So I just immersed myself. I just had to find out what the hell happened. And there was kind of a mixture of fear, of trepidation, curiosity, also some degree of wonder too, Randy. It was like there's billions of people on this planet.
Why me? Why me?
Why me? It's like that part didn't compute. It really didn't. So long story short, eventually I moved to San Diego, California, and I hooked up with the San Diego UFO Society, which was a well-established group of UFO researchers, and they were really into networking with other researchers and experiencers, not only in the Southwest, California, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, etc., but throughout the whole country, even into Puerto Rico. So, I plugged myself right into that group, began attending the monthly lectures, and eventually I got connected with Barbara Bartholic of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Along the way, I became good friends with Evie Lorgan, who was living in North County, San Diego at the time. We kept running into each other synchronistically at these lectures and conferences, and I kept wanting to talk to her, but one thing or another prevented us from finally having a chat. And then one fine day, because in San Diego UFO Society, we would have two lectures. So one would be in the main part of San Diego, Mission Valley, and then another one would be in North County, San Diego. And so I was sitting at a lecture in North County, San Diego, and who plops down next to me but Evie Lorgan, this gal that I've been trying to talk to all this time. And
right.
We just began chatting, and then we began meeting each other in the astral dreamscape, all in the up and up, none of this weird astral sex hoochie-coo. And so we began talking in the astral dreamscape about getting a support group going. It was bizarre, and then long story short, we set up an alien abduction support group where people from as far away as Las Vegas and LA and Orange County would come down to San Diego. And that was an interesting experience too. So that's pretty much my journey in a nutshell.
Let me ask you this. You said you were in Germany and came back to the United States. Were you in a military family?
Yes, I was. But
okay.
I was there in 1990 for a summer language program.
Okay. So I had to ask that because I wasn't certain I remembered. And I always look for a point of contact, a point of connection of how they gain access, whether you're coming from undisclosed programs such as Ultra, Monarch, any of these black projects. I always look for the underlying point of contact because they seem to have access to people and records and histories that, even given the technology, you're a few years younger than me. I was in grade school in the 60s when I was tapped into Project Talent, which is what I believe it was. I'm saying that loosely because Talent was an umbrella organization that basically pulled in numerous profiles and then sorted. It was like a sorting bin for MK Ultra and various other programs. And I always wondered how they knew where to look, given that we didn't at that time allegedly have the sophisticated computer systems that we have today. But what we did have, and we are the allergy brothers today, so sniffles and coughs all over the place. Sorry, sports fans, but that's just life. What they did have were military records, detailed military records, including profiles, blood types, medical workups, all of the things that you would do to profile people. And of course, yes, they did have computers. What I know about the technology that they had then was far more advanced than what we were told. It wasn't really the great big IBM Univacs and spinning tape reels and card readers. They had what you would have called probably first generation digital technology based on what I saw later on. But gaining access to us became something of a point of, then we see the vector, then we see how people were pulled in, how they themselves are. This is like a taxonomy of human beings in the sorting and collecting of data and then targeting people. Mysteriously enough, in my case, I was probably targeted through my father's military records. I was also targeted through my blood type, which is an AB negative blood type, as well as early IQ testing, which put me in, and I'm not bragging here, this, IQ test, however you take that, but I tested at 171, which put me right in the zone. And I know this because I had another kid that I grew up with that I met a few years ago. Similar experience, similar background, same school. We parted company at 10 years old, but one of the first things he said to me was, "What about those IQ tests?" He said, "Dude, mine was 170. I still can't believe it." And I kind of shrugged it off, but I thought it was interesting because the same guy sitting in my house having a beer 3 or 4 years ago in front of my wife began talking about the underground bases in the mountains around the town where we grew up, small rural town not far from the capital city. So I always look for these vectors and the ways that they access. And you being in military, obviously you're on bases. They have access to you completely because your medical workups are being done as well. Do you have any memories that go back to your time on military bases and anything that stands out?
Yes, I was able to piece it together over time. I had a problematic childhood as far as my health was concerned, which I'm not going to elaborate, but it had something to do with
I'm not surprised by that. Yep.
Had something to do with the allopathic medical system even back then,
Sure.
right? So let's just say I had some adverse issues, and my parents, being dutiful, well, my dad was in the Navy. He was in the Brown Water Navy in Vietnam, did 2 tours, those little patrol boats going up and down the Mekong Delta. Mm-hmm. And then after that, he segued into being a crew member on board aircraft carriers. And so a lot of my youth was spent going from one naval air station to another, right? NAS Corpus Christi in Texas, near NAS Alameda in San Francisco Bay, and then eventually I moved the northern part of Silicon Valley because my dad at the time, before he got out of the Navy, was stationed at Naval Air Station Moffett Field there in Sunnyvale, a very spooky kind of place.
Mm-hmm.
With, Lockheed there and all that stuff. And, my parents did what they were told to do. I was ill. I was sick from whatever had been done to me. And military personnel operate under the Military Code of Justice,
right?
And the Uniform Military Code of Justice.
UCMJ, and right?
Yeah, and so when they don't have any sick days, for example, they go to sick bay. They don't just call in and say, "Well, I'm not coming to work today." It doesn't work that way. They got to be practically at death's door. They got to go in and see a medical person. And typically in the military, Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, the doctors tend to be high-ranking officers, and very often captains in the Navy.
Colonels, majors, definitely
colonels,
captains.
majors.
Yeah.
Yes, and so when, long story short, when a Navy captain tells an enlisted man like my dad, "Well, your son has some kind of unspecified condition. You need to get him on such and such medications, and you need to bring him to such and such facilities," right? And my dad, not knowing any better, because that's what military families did when their kids, their dependents were ill, they took them to military doctors. Right. That's just the way it was. So I want to stress that at the outset, that my parents were not in on it. They were just being dutiful military parents. So my mom, under instructions from the doctors, would give me, in all likelihood, some kind of tranquilizer or depressant prior to our road trips to these medical facilities. And my dad was always a painfully slow driver. Okay. So, and then one of the places we went to was Oak Knoll Naval Hospital. So from San Jose, California to Oak Knoll, and even before that, from Daly City, California, because Daly City is right next to San Francisco. From Daly City to Oak Knoll, the way my dad drove, it was a very long trip anyway. But my mom would administer these pills to me and basically knock me out. On one occasion, because generally I do not remember any of the trips from, most of this happened in Daly City, actually, at the outset. I don't remember, except for one occasion, any of the trips from Daly City to Oak Knoll Naval Hospital. And we've since found out, Randy, as you know, that Oak Knoll is notorious for mind control. We found out that later. And also, one of the places I was taken to was Letterman Army Hospital on the Presidio, another notorious.
Oh my, Michael
Yeah.
Aquino land.
Yeah, Michael
Yeah.
Aquino land. So my mom would give me these pills. It would knock me out. I would never remember the trip from Daly City to Oak Knoll Naval Hospital, or to the Presidio, except on one occasion. I woke up in a drugged out stupor. My dad back then, you remember, station wagons were pretty popular, and like,
Oh yeah. We had them too.
Yeah.
Yep.
You know, the middle bench, right, right behind the driver's area, was where me and my younger brother were, and my younger brother. Well, my two younger brothers likewise have had alien abduction experiences. And so my next younger brother, I momentarily came to, but I was still in this kind of drug-induced haze. And I noticed my younger brother kind of laying on the bench seat next to me, likewise in a drugged-out stupor, right? Because he was going through similar issues. He was going through health issues at the time as well. So there were occasions when I would wake up in a hospital with electrodes and whatnot stuck to my scalp. And I'd wake up in a darkened room and I'd see these monitors and whatnot. I'd immediately be aware I was in some kind of a clinic. And, you know, people should understand I'm like a 6, 7, 8-year-old boy. I mean, I'm just barely just coming to terms with life, let alone all this stuff. So there were occasions when I would wake up in a medical facility, presumably at Oak Knoll Naval Hospital or the Presidio. And on one occasion, my mom took me to Letterman Army Hospital at the Presidio. She was told to take a specific elevator at the end of a corridor, not in the main lobby, right? So she took me down this corridor to the very end. We took the elevator there, up a number of flights, a number of stories. It opened, we got out, and then she led me to this office door. And then she left me there, right? My very next conscious moment, I come to awareness in a darkened office, and I'm groping my way to the door. I open the door, and there's my mom waiting for me in the corridor, like just perfect timing. It's quite possible that at some level, my mom may have been subjected to some degree of mind control as well, because she doesn't seem to remember. Well, she's pretty advanced in years now, but even when she wasn't so advanced in years, she didn't really recall a lot of things from back then. And there was another interesting aspect too, and I talked to Nish about this when I was on her show.
Yeah.
And privately. Yeah. Great interview. And there was this mysterious older guy would show up in a cardigan sweater, very tall, older guy. And he would sit down with my mom in the living room, and we lived in military dependent housing, what we called the projects in Daly City, right by Midway Elementary School, Midway named after the Battle of Midway. And all the neighborhood kids, I didn't know this at the time, I didn't register really, but there were the dependents of Navy, Marine Corps, and visiting Air Force personnel, right? So that was the crowd that I grew up in. And you know, my folks being of ethnic Filipino heritage, most of their friends that came over tended to be Filipino naval servicemen that were friends of my dad at work, right? Or their wives tended to be Filipino ladies. And the only quote unquote white people that ever showed up at our home was my friends or my siblings' friends. It was noteworthy, put it that way, when an older man, a Caucasian man, would show up. And there were a number of instances when he would sit there in the living room talking to my mom about me. And there were times that I would try to listen in. I was like, what the hell are they talking about? Okay. And then on one occasion, it sounds corny and kind of embarrassing, but I was really into toy soldiers, playing soldier back then. And I had this. Nowadays, of course, we would have these, active shooter drills because the kids playing with guns or things that look like guns. But anyway, I had this toy rifle, and it had a sling on it, and I connected one of my belts via the belt buckle to a loop in the harness of this toy rifle. The long story short, I try to make it into a grappling hook, right? And I'm using it to climb up the side of my bunk bed, because I used to sleep on the top. Now, meanwhile, my mom is out in the living room with this older white guy. And long story short, the belt buckle came undone from the rifle sling. I fell.
Yes.
And the trigger got caught in my earlobe. And to this day, I still have a scar.
Wow.
Blood everywhere. And so I go out to the living room, bawling my eyes out, blood all over the place. And my mom was nonplussed, right? And she's sitting there with this older white guy, a big, tall guy. And I'm just crying and crying. And then eventually my mom took me to the doctors, and I got stitches and whatnot. But, the point of relevance was he was there again, talking to my mom about me. And long before my mom, became really elderly, I asked her about this old white guy, right? She didn't know what I was talking about. So, long story short, that there was these aspects of my life where there seemed to be some kind of medical interest in me. And interspersed with that, and this is even before we moved to Daly City, because my dad, prior to that, was stationed in San Diego. And I was taken again to another, we now know, notorious mind control place, Naval Medical Center in Balboa Park, San Diego. Okay, I was taken there too, right? So when we were in San Diego, I had this memory, which didn't really make sense to me until much later. And I would reckon I would have been kindergarten around that time. I was in a darkened room. There were other kids my age, presumably around my age, and we were each seated at our own desk. And on each of our desks was like some lights, some light bulbs in different colors. And there was a lady there, and she wore, it's just so stereotypical, but I seem to recall her wearing, for the time, almost a Agent Scully kind of pantsuit outfit, right? And she had a male assistant there as well, but she was the one in charge. And in a darkened room, there was a little bit of illumination, enough to see her, enough to see the other kids. We were instructed to use the power of our minds to cause these lights to activate on the desk, right? And it wasn't just like a white light, but there were different colored lights, red and other lights. And each kid around this circle, we'd be seated in our desks, would be instructed, okay, it's your turn, James, go ahead and make the thing light up. I don't remember how successful I was, but I do remember some other kids were able to activate the lights, right? And so I look back on that, and I also vaguely remember experiences where those stereotypical old ESP cards with the wavy lines and all that stuff, I was shown those. I was shown those at one point. So it was only much later, when I started having MILAB experiences as an adult, that I was able to look back and see that, and I reckon that because I was born into this military family, they had access to all my medical records and blood work, and presumably my DNA profile.
Yeah.
I think that was the way that they were able to access me and start utilizing me.
Yeah. Going back for a minute into that memory, did you, being in a room with other children, were these children who were not your normal everyday classmates?
I'd never seen them before. Never.
These are people that came, that were basically aggregated into a breakout group.
Yes.
Because I have memories of being shown symbols on a very specific type of technology that should not have existed when it did. And I've recounted this before, that couple of things. My mother had this weird habit of buying me odd things for Christmas. And you mentioned the cards. I distinctly remember one Christmas receiving the Kreskin's ESP cards, which this would have been back in the, 60s, 70s, somewhere, was not a usual gift to give to a kid who was, let's just say, under the age of, puberty, adolescence. My mother had this fascination with psychic phenomena. I was also the recipient of a Ouija board one year. But these symbols that they put on the screen, I distinctly remember that these symbols somehow were interactive and that I was interacting with them. And that there was some kind of test in terms of how we received information symbolically. And years later, I think maybe it was Andy Bashago told me, that was what he called semiotics training, which is basically where you learn to process information on many different levels and modalities. And one of the biggest ones is decoding symbology. So, I'm always interested to hear what people remember from those specific encounters, because as a kid, you wind up in a strange place in a darkened room with people you don't know and other children who are not part of your, let's say, friend group or normal classroom experience.
Yes, and there was other aspects that were unusual too. I've talked about this before. It was those mysterious hearing vans, right? What happened with us was, and I found out this was a story echoed by many other people, right around the second grade. In my case, it was the second grade. And yes, I would have been attending either Midway Elementary School or Bayshore Elementary School, which is just a few blocks away in Daly City. Our whole class was taken out, and the teacher made it sound like it was a really fun, cool thing to do. You're all going to go out, you're going to have a hearing test, right? And of course, any kind of break in the monotony was fine with us, right?
Yeah.
So we all go out and we all line up, and we take turns going into the hearing mobile and take tests. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Years later, they pluck you out of class, but they don't do it in mass anymore. They just do it singly in ones and twos. And in my case, by now I'm in high school. I'm in like sophomore year, like 10th grade. And I was already really into cutting class by then. We had 6 periods, right?
Right. Yeah.
And it was like we had to get an admit card to get us back into school. And some of us would cut certain classes, certain periods more than others. So you would need more than one admit card. Okay, this admit card is for first period. Yeah. This admit card is for third period. Don't get them mixed up, right? And the class I was pulled out of was a class that I seldom attended. I used to cut that class all the time, right? But somehow, on the day that I came in there, probably with an admit card, right, that I forged note that I wrote myself, they plucked me out of class. And of course, even as a teenager, whippy, yippee, I'm going to go get another hearing test, right? And so I had to go clear to the other side of the campus. And there was the mobile hearing van, but this time there was only like 2 or 3 other kids there. never seen any of them before,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we get in there, I put the headphones on, and they instructed me on what I needed to do, right? And they're going to play a tone. If I hear it, to open my hand, like I would have it in a closed fist. If I heard a tone, open my hand, palm out, right?
Right.
And long story short, he kept playing these tones rather, and I kept hearing them, and I kept opening my hand, and to the point where he would almost argue with me, the technician. Are you sure you hear that? Are you positive you can hear that? I go, yeah, I can hear it. And then he'd make another adjustment, play another tone. I could hear that. So even for someone who seemed to do this as a vocation, if you will, the fact that I could hear these tones befuddled him. And not knowing any better, I can only surmise that perhaps it had something to do with tuning, whether or not the technician was aware of this, need to know being what it is.
Right.
It's possible that the tones were meant to determine if we have implants of some kind, if we have them in our head, or ear implants, or whatever. So yeah, and that was, and I spoke to another abductee who told me a similar thing, where they were confounded over the fact that this woman, and she was a teenage girl at the time, could hear these tones that no one else seemed to be able to hear. So, and the other person I know for a fact has had ET experiences and MILAB experiences. Okay, small sample size to be sure, but who knows?
Well, small compared to what we understand. The programs themselves, which ran from probably the late 1950s to, as far as I know, they've never been formally discontinued, although they have been buried and compartmentalized into other programs. So you're talking potentially tens of thousands of, quote, volunteers. Yeah, we really volunteered. Of these programs, with a statistical database that I'm pretty sure was pretty well attuned, because of the fact that they had already pre-selected everybody that's inside of it. So when you're dealing with that kind of statistical base, you have that's considered really a gold zone for being able to data mine. Do you believe, or do you know, that you are in fact implanted?
I've never seen, I felt things beneath my epidermis before, at the base of the skull.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had all kinds of surgical marks, scoops and stuff. I've had, woke up with an embossed, basically, triangle on my kneecap, and also a scoop mark on the same knee. It could have been done by ETs, not necessarily military. But I've had a lot of marks. I've always wondered about the oval-shaped lime green marks, which wash off, in a day or so. I always wondered if that was put there by the military and or the ETs. And also I've had these splotchy, irregular kind of aqua blue kind of marks on me, which likewise wash off after a while. And then also I've had on this arm right here, if I shaved the hair off this arm, I could still see the faint protrusions and still feel them, nowhere near as pronounced as they were. This would have been the early 90s. I was in San Diego by then. I showed them to Daryl Sims, if you remember in the old days, veteran alien abduction researcher from Houston, Texas. Basically, it's a pattern of these raised circular protrusions that went in a line up to about my elbow area, and then it came out into a big diamond-shaped pattern. And they were raised, really visibly, and you could feel that these things were sticking up. Showed them to Daryl Sims and others, E.B. Lorgan. Eventually, the protrusions, the raised marks, got whittled down over time, I guess. And then on other occasions, I would wake up with very angry-looking magenta red marks on my arm,
Yeah.
which roughly sometimes in the shape of a triangle, but not always. And with no discomfort, they were just there the next morning, right? And I've woken up with the puncture wounds too, in the crook of my elbow, my upper bicep. So they've used me as a pincushion, so to speak, whoever they may be. But getting back to the question about the implants, I suspect because back in the day, not so much now, but in the early 90s, I used to hear a lot of Morse type beeps in my head. And there were times when I would hear, it sounds corny, but I would hear like bouncy kind of electronic music long before the emo thing became popular. I would just hear like this bouncy kind of electronic music, and also once in a while, interestingly enough, classical music. And if I shifted my head ever so slightly in bed, I would lose the signal. Now, I don't know if it had to do with fillings or whatever it had at the time, but certainly the fillings wouldn't account for the Morse beeps. I wouldn't think, right?
No, your
So
head's a resonance chamber. It wouldn't be directional from internal. I mean, the fillings are interesting. That's a whole other field
it
of
is.
topic we could go into.
And I
Because
did hear just to interject for a second, military transmissions in my head, what sounded like military people talking to each other. I don't know why I'm laughing, but
because otherwise you would go insane. Because it is insane. And yeah, I've had the experience of waking up, hearing conversations, codes, even numeric codes, but beeps, odd signals. And, it's interesting you mentioned music, and specifically electronic music, because the further down the rabbit hole we've gone over the years, we just learn more and more about how popular music was engineered. I mean, just the work that Dave McGowan did with, the weird scenes inside Laurel Canyon, the history and background of people like Jim Morrison from the Doors, whose background was not dissimilar from yours. His father was in the Mekong Delta before the major insurgents in 1964. Was it the Mekong Delta? Yeah, it was an incident that actually sparked the escalation of the Vietnam War. So it was like 1964. But all these military kids show up in the rock and roll scene, and they still do. And it's kind of a recurrent thing that crosses over into what we call MILABS and mind control operations, is this predilection that these people have of a giftedness with arts and specifically music and access. I mean, I now look at Kurt Cobain, for instance, from Nirvana, and based on some information I was given maybe about 5 years ago, every indication Kurt Cobain was total MK Ultra. That this just continues. It just continues on and on. But have you ever woken up with what I would call, I can only describe this as a reverberation, a sense of a pressure? It's sonic, but it's not so much audible as sensory, almost like great big bass speakers. Have you ever experienced this?
yes, I have. Similar to when you mentioned the bass speaker aspect, because I've been to many concerts, and you could hear and feel the bass reverberate in your chest cavity, right? And
Okay.
so when I've had those things, it felt like, yes, I would feel in the chest cavity, but it wasn't localized. It was like my whole anatomy, but also my head, where I would just almost like a combination of vibration, but also being like in a pressure chamber almost, where you just feel it's a resonance of some kind of frequency modulation that's just making your whole body feel like it's in some kind of energy field. So I've had that before. And also sometimes what that comes with. It comes at a tail end of some kind of a weird dream or experience too.
Yes, that's where I was going with this, James. Is that you wake up and you know how you wake up or like as the dream is kind of fading. I mean, I do this because I keep a dream journal. And a lot of times when I have that sense, I try to get something down. I keep a notepad, pen beside the bed, and try to just get something down, even if it's just an image or a symbol or something, because I still get a lot of symbol feeds in my dream work that I have to decrypt. And some of these come up, in very interesting ways in everyday life where I'll look at something and I'll go, that is really familiar. But the sensory that I just described is this ultra low frequency. And oddly enough, I'll tell you when it triggers me. Like I've done nightclubs and discos and things like that. And yeah, they have these great big bass speakers, rock concerts. The most triggered I get by this particular type of frequency is in traffic when a car pulls up that has these great big ass boom speakers in the trunk. And the low resonance frequency isn't so much audible as you're actually feeling it, and you're feeling it through metal and glass. And that triggers what is only a snapshot memory of being in a room that I now can identify as an anechoic chamber, and how those frequencies appear to have been used in some sort of splitting operation. Because when I hear this particular frequency, and it's very specific, under specific circumstances, I panic. I have high anxiety. I am very prone to panic attacks. And when I'm sitting next to a car like this, I just want to get the hell away from it because it's triggering the shit out of me. So it's interesting that you also share that experience.
And also the visual aspect to it as well. People will notice that, especially around the 90s, more and more we were being hammered in concerts,
Yes.
in nightclubs,
Yep.
in movies with the strobe effect, which used to drive me, still drives me crazy.
Yeah.
And then increasingly, you would see police cars with the strobe thing going
that's
on.
what they're using now, especially over. I noticed police cars in the East, Japan especially, tend to use those stroboscopic lights. But I've seen them here in the U.S. too.
Yeah, so have I. I've seen them in California, and it's like, are they trying to induce seizures in everybody? It's
Yeah.
like, what's this all about? And like, when you're in a place like a nightclub or a concert or someplace where they got this massive strobe operation going on, it's like, I'm like this. I'm just pinching my eyes shut and even through closed eyelids, you can still,
Yes.
see the light behind, and that, I don't want to get triggered into anything. So, and it amazes me how people could be there dancing and spinning around. It's like with no apparent effect, but me, I'm just like freaking out, like, get me the hell out of here. Right. So the whole audio visual thing, is a big part of this. And I'd like to throw it out to your audience. A couple of things that I went through in some of the mind control experiences, where it would be a theater of the mind, essentially. I'd be, for all intents and purposes, I'd be laying in bed, but I'd be getting beamed in the head, in different parts of my body, sometimes the scrotum area, sometimes the midsection. But what would happen is they would zap particularly the part of your mind that induces the heavy sleep. And when one gets into the heavy sleep, that's when they can start inserting all this virtual environment stuff into your mind and cause you to live out or experience a virtual reality scenario type experience. And it could vary. Like sometimes on one occasion, I was sleeping in my bed, but the theater of mind theater playing out in my mind was I was laying in a hospital bed, and on brackets on the wall were two televisions, one slightly larger than the other, and there was some kind of sporting event going on both of the screens, right? And that's a common theme in some of these stage managed, hijacked mind control things I've experienced. Is there's some kind of sport-like activity playing out either in what seems to be like an arena where I'm looking down, or a theater kind of scenario looking down, or in this example, I appear to be laying in a hospital bed, but I'm looking at these TV screens on monitors, and there's some kind of sporting event going on. And even as I'm laying there, that conscious part of my mind, I could feel the rapid eye movement going on, the REM. And then when I'm able to pry my eyes open, the whole scenario stops, right? And sometimes, and this happened on a number of occasions, and not necessarily the same kind of mind controlling either, as far as I can tell. I pry my eyes open, and suddenly I'm back in bed, and the illusion stops. And then I could feel immediately a part of my brain getting zapped, and it's intensifying. And it's the part of my brain that induces the heavy lidded, deep sleep kind of feeling. And so I close my eyelids again, and then whammo, the moment I close my eyes, I'm laying in the hospital bed looking at those two monitors with some kind of sporting event going on. And there are variations of this. Sometimes we find ourselves like in a darkened theater, sometimes alone or with a group of people. On one occasion, I was sitting in a darkened theater, and it was so blatantly obvious, Randy. There was like a couple of individuals, like a couple of rows behind over to the left, and they were just watching me. And on this theater screen were a lot of action type scenes, car chases and war scenes and whatnot, right? And interspersed with sporting events again. So those things have happened to me. But one thing I've noticed is when you're in the virtual reality environment and you manage to pry your eyes open, and immediately you're out of the spell or whatever it is. And I felt this on numerous occasions. They zap the particular part of the brain which induces the heavy sleep. The moment you close your eyes, whammo, you're back in that virtual reality. And another quick comment about another type of mind control that I've experienced. I call it the silent concert. And for me, being an old school concert guy, this used to drive me crazy. Okay?
Just got chills. Keep going.
Where I would find myself in, by all appearances, a darkened concert hall. I'd be surrounded with people. We'd all be looking in the same direction. There's a lighted stage. And it was just simulated to be as if there's the roadies and the tech crew are setting up for a gig. So you would see people moving around, and you would see people playing around with what seems to be the mic stand, and you would see the amplifier stacks there. I mean, it looked for all the world like a concert was going to play. But you'd sit there, and I knew it was a real form of mind control because of the glacier pace of how the thing played out. It wasn't just a series of unrelated juxtaposed images that just flashed in my mind's eye. I mean, you're sitting there, and every excruciating second is passing in slow motion, and you're sitting there, nobody's saying a word. Everyone's in this darkened hall. We're all looking at the stage. And after an interminable period of time, finally, some band takes the stage. And sometimes they'll insert something in my mind like, oh, it's Led Zeppelin or it's The Who or something, right? And this is the maddening part, is they just stand there and no sound comes out. Where I call it the silent concert. It's some kind of, because I know that a big part of the mind control seems to be to put us in a state of frustration for whatever purpose, for whatever reason. Whether it's a scenario where they try to make us repair or fix something that's patently unfixable or unrepairable, or frustration type dreams where you're in a classroom setting, you're never told what the assignment is. Everyone's turning in their assignments to the teacher. You don't know what's going on. You're frustrated, right? Well, anyway, in these silent concert dreams, you just sit there for hours and no music is played. And finally, on one occasion, I found myself in this silent concert scenario, and I just couldn't take it anymore, Randy. Deflation set in. I stood up. I began yelling at all the people around me. This is mind control. No one's playing any music. You're just going to sit here. And they're sitting there looking up at me. I'm making a spectacle out of myself. But by that point, I'd gone through that so many times. I knew what it was, and I was just so frustrated. I had to try to wake these people up.
So do you think that that may have been your own break point where you, let's just say you remove consent at that point, you left them know that you were fully apprised of their activities, and that this was the more I think about this, it feels like a screen for something else that was going on. I mean, we talk about screen memories, and, it's so common that they're able to overlay onto the reality stream familiar things, while at the same time, what's really going on in the background, if you could break that screen image, which is heavily subliminal and laced with some type of process that's arresting synapses in a particular part of the brain. It's like, and I've said this before, walking around, and because I was trained a certain way, I tend to use peripheral vision pretty heavily. And every once in a while, I've had memories where I would turn my eyes a certain way and the matrix would glitch. I don't know how else to put it. It would pixelate the reality just ever so slightly. It's just little flickers where the pixelates. And I'm thinking there's something behind the curtain. It's kind of like Wizard of Oz. Don't look at the man behind the curtain, which Wizard of Oz is total MK Ultra programming. Do you feel like at that moment you sort of broke through the screen?
As far as that type of scenario was concerned, I was never able to see beyond the frustrating silent concert scenario. There were occasions when I knew I was being mind controlled. And on this particular occasion, it happened on 2 successive weekends, pretty much. Yeah, 2 successive weekends where the previous weekend I was put through my paces where it was an active shooter scenario long before that term became popularized by the media, right? Where I was on the rescue team, and the scenario was to go into a school and rescue children that were being held by some gunmen, right?
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. And then the week after that, the plot was reversed, right? Where I was the shooter. Long story short.
Yeah.
But in this case, the targets were like cardboard cutouts, and simulations appeared to be people. But the beaming I was being subjected to in this latter scenario, and the fear that was being put into my mind of having to wipe everyone out because if I didn't, the mafia was going to get me, right?
Yeah.
And also, they gave me this visual image of brain matter, but in my mind, they made me think of spaghetti. Like I was presented with a big bowl of spaghetti.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
And it also
spaghetti.
Messy spaghetti, but it also looked like to me like a brain. But those could have been the thoughts inserted in my head. So in this, I'm not going to go into the scenario. I actually wrote about the whole thing under a pseudonym years ago because when I woke up from it, I was still being beamed. I thought it was my last day on Earth, Randy, because it was like I was getting beamed so badly that I could feel my brain twitching beneath my scalp. And then when the beaming intensified, my eyes would involuntarily get crossed and everything would just turn white, right? So I imagine me, it took me 6 hours because I'm kind of pedantic about, getting the grammar and everything right, 6 hours to type out this scenario.
Well, we both know how compulsive and anal we can be about stuff like that.
That's right.
That's why I don't have my book finished yet.
I feel you're paying them.
I don't trust spell checkers. I spell checkers. Anyway, we have bumped up against the clock, and the clock is hard today because you and I have lives. And I want people to, we're going to dodge over to the other side to talk to our friends in the Patreon. And that's the deep woo section. But I got to tell you something. This all is deep woo, but it's real. This is real stuff. Let people know where they can find more real stuff by telling them where they can find you.
You can go to my website, thecosmicswitchboard.com. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Facebook. I'm going to open an Instagram at some point because I've been told good things about it, right? Like not as much harassment and censorship as other platforms. So that's where you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and also my website, thecosmicswitchboard.com.
Yeah, we'll put all those links up with the show, and we thank you for joining us on this segment. We'll dodge over to the other side and go deep. This is Off Planet Radio signing off for now. Stay level.
This is Off Planet Radio.